Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Frontline Advantage. We have a very special guest today, someone I've known for over 10 years. In fact, we were first introduced by another one of our friends when I had moved to India to build the original version of Clickit. We've stayed in touch many, many years later, and now you all know us as Teamforce AI and what we're doing for the frontline workforce. I wanted to invite Veer Kashyap on today, who spent a lot of time looking at the blue-collar market. Initially working at Babajob.com in India, a company he co-founded and that eventually exited. And then most recently, his time at Indeed, where he was focused on global operations. So ladies and gentlemen, welcome Veer Kashyap. Hi Veer, how are you doing today?
Hey, Vivek, great to be with you as always. Wish I could be in person, but virtual is the next best thing.
Absolutely. So Veer, you've spent a ton of time in the space as we've talked about. Tell us a little bit about what excited you. You were raised in the US, you moved to India to start Babajob. What was the thesis and how did you go about building and executing on that thesis?
Yeah, I mean, basically the thesis of, for Babajob was kind of very aligned with the thesis of why I went to India in the first place, was that, hey, we're seeing technology moving at a very fast pace into many sectors. And we had already at that point, when we were thinking of the idea of Babajob, when I met Sean, he was already starting up, and you had stuff like Facebook, you had the social graph coming into form, and you had LinkedIn. But, when we looked around and said, hey, that's only impacting a very small sector of society that have, full access to, fully literate, have access to. At that point, it was still more, most of the folks were on desktop on those applications. It was desktop. And so it was impacting a very small percentage of, it was more developed economy focused and more, let's say, white collar and professionals of a certain kind of socioeconomic group that were benefiting from that. So we said, hey, there's a whole different section of society that actually can probably actually get a much bigger benefit delta than the folks. Yes, it's nice that folks in the developed markets of the U.S. can get better job opportunities for sure, and but like you can actually have a much more transformational change in someone's life in a developing market like India, where you kind of get someone's income from let's say $100 a month to $300. That is transformational for the family and for multi generations. And so I think that's what really drew me to the livelihood opportunity in India, saying, okay, if we can help unlock some of this transformational growth, that's what can be hugely impactful.
I love that. We today focus on the frontliner blue collar market here in the US, which right now is starting to become something a lot more companies focus on. Take us back though to India 10 years ago, where when we even think about the Indian market today, the most common thing we hear, and it's not one of our target markets, but when we talk to people from there, they're like, rather than focusing on engaging or focusing on retention of my frontline or blue collar workforce, I just need to pay them a little bit more. What was it like selling into that environment 10 years ago? And I realize that if you want to share with the audience exactly what Babajob did, something SMS based or mobile based on talent acquisition as a marketplace, is that correct?
Yeah, no, exactly. We're mobile first, one of the first, global marketplaces focused on blue collar mobile first, approach, which was very unique back then in 08, 09 time period. And so we basically took a mobile first approach, and also not and this is before you really had widespread internet access. So it was kind of non-smartphone mobile first kind of approach, where we have to kind of rely on a lot of technologies like USSD, IVRs, SMS, things like that to kind of to give folks access, and have to deal with that stuff in local language, which is a little bit more challenging when you don't have a full kind of user interface that can accommodate that.
There's a recent stat from Emergence Capital that less than 1% of all VC funding in the couple most recent years has gone toward companies building for the deskless workforce. How did you excite investors and others in your network around the market opportunity and what you all were pursuing?
Yeah, I mean, it was tough. We had to speak to a lot of people who would understand the story, kind of understand the transformation that was happening, and so it definitely wasn't easy. And at that point, the first question we'd get is, "Hey, but folks that don't have access to the Internet of Technology, how?" And that was like the first question. And look at where we are now. That's no longer a question. It's now thanks to geo, thanks to COVID, thanks to demonetization. This is in India. You kind of now have an assumption that there's at least some connectivity that folks have. At that point, that was the biggest question we used to get from any client or investor, saying, "Okay, but it sounds very promising, but how are people going to even access the internet?" Right? And so we had some fundamental issues to really deal with before we could even reach the other parts of our business.
So walk us through the evolution. You start building this business, mobile based. What was the traction like? What were the real benefits and tailwinds? And then what were the challenges at the same time that kind of led you to decide whatever you decided to do with the business?
Sure. I mean, well, as I said, I'd say the major challenge was that, hey, how do we, get people? How do we build like a profile of someone so you can even know, what they're interested in, what their skill sets are, what their education is, you have to have a lot of basic information. Just knowing that, even just capturing that information in that type of environment was challenging. So I'd say having to kind of build and maintain half a dozen user interfaces itself is a big challenge. We actually had physical servers sitting in a location in Bangalore. I think it was a company called NetMagic. And I remember when we finally moved to the cloud, we had these boxes that came back, and we're like, "Wow, we should remember this. These are actually the physical servers the stuff used to run on," right? So you had so many of these. We went through those evolutions, obviously the mobile evolution, but even this cloud evolution, which from a developing software standpoint, made things incredibly more difficult. Even getting developers in Bangalore to have reliable connectivity was even a challenge, right? You have to deal with, right? So there were a lot of these fun, very basic challenges now that seem in retrospect very basic, and thankfully they're kind of mostly now you can take it for granted, even in most cities in India. But at that point, basic connectivity was not something you could take for granted.
So what did the traction look like as you ramped up and solved some of those challenges at its peak? Where did the business sort of get to?
Yeah, no, I mean, in the beginning, it was actually, you had to gather all those job listings or openings out there, right? And I think in the beginning, a lot of those are still in places like the newspaper, right? And so a lot of it was we had some processes and some systems to kind of go out and capture some of that data, but it's still pretty manual at the beginning, going out and getting that data from places like the newspaper, putting it onto our system, finding out who are the employers here who are hiring in volume, right? And so I think and then convincing them that they can use a technology tool to help solve their problem, right? And so I think those are the fundamental challenges on the demand side, and figuring out who's hiring. Then of course you have the supply side, which is a more challenging issue in some ways, in the sense that these are all individuals, right? And so how do you reach out to them in a cost-effective way while keeping your cost of acquisition low? And it's not like as I said, this was before you had, we didn't have any local social platforms that were that big at that point. And so, we really actually, I'd say one of the key things that worked for us early on was the relationships with the telcos, right? And so we sold through the telcos. We were able to kind of run some distribution partnerships, which also gave us a revenue, but more importantly, gave us access to those customers. So at least we knew, okay, this is these phone numbers, where they were, what types of jobs they're looking for. We were able to kind of crack our first million, let's say, candidates, workers it was largely thanks to telco partnerships.
Did you have anything in your experience that made you feel more connected to these frontline workers? For me, my first job was at Wendy's, and I've always had a belief that, irrespective of one's position or career, that, great ideas can come from anyone. What sort of emotionally connected you to go on a journey like this of many years to focus on this kind of market when it may not be perceived as the most in-demand kind of opportunity?
I can't pinpoint a particular personal experience or like aha moment but I think it was a combination of, spending time in India growing up, and then spending some initial time there while researching, business ideas at that time, and just kind of noticing that this was a huge gap, right, in the market. That was just a business opportunity gap, an impact opportunity gap. So on multiple levels, I did some volunteering work with an educational institution, and kind of noticed that's what was holding people back. It was really just that access to the information. It wasn't, motivation. People motivated, willing to work hard. It's literally just, hey, you're just missing that piece from getting it, and just knowledge about that thing, which really shouldn't be a reason why someone can't reach their full potential.
Is this an opportunity that you think is more primed today than it may have been back in 08, 09?
Yeah, well, I mean, today now, we have definitely already, at least one unicorn in this direct space. We'll call it sourcing in India. That's there existing. We have multiple players now. So it's obviously, I think with any opportunity, you can be early, but then, and there's not many other players in the market. But once the opportunity is kind of obvious, then you're going to have substantially more competition, right? And so I think that's the trade-off, right? You can be early and be alone, and then you can have multiple players in it. So we have, a couple of folks who, a couple of companies started soon after us that attempted it, and it was all, so it's all, as in alternative, as and a lot of what it comes down to is timing. And then if you can make it so that you can persevere, like as you have built the business, being able to absorb those pivots and being built in a sustainable way, then you can kind of, snake your way through some of those pitfalls, right? I mean, your business model has emerged tremendously since you started out, right? And now you kind of found your way to this very interesting space. And, it's something I always wondered, why do businesses just want to keep on hiring and hiring if they have folks they're just not able to retain because they don't maybe have a pulse on why they're happy or unhappy, why they're leaving. If some of the money they're putting in, they have a lot of people in hiring in business workers have an obsession with cost per hire. We have to keep the cost per hire low. And it's like, hey, listen, if you look at it more holistically and can say, hey, can we actually just not have to hire at this volume? Maybe we can approach this problem differently. But it was, so that's what I found very refreshing about your current business model, is that it's actually focusing exactly on that. It's saying, okay, we don't have to continuously, and I think it became it became a lot more obvious to people throughout the pandemic and the last 2-3 years okay, this is a major roadblock in me growing my business and being able to serve my customers. And so if I can not just focus on bringing people in, but retaining the people I had, make sure they're happy, then that solves a decent chunk of my problem. And I think that's kind of what's great about solutions like what you guys are building, is trying to make people think more holistically about their whole strategy, their whole talent strategy.
Yeah, thank you. A lot resonates with what you talked about. I mean, this notion that employee experience, so many people have talked about customer experience, CX, and this idea of the employee experience. And it's not just, getting people in the door and then waiting for an exit interview, or believing that, hey, they're just chasing another buck. It's all down to the money. I mean, you have to be competitive on wages, but people would be surprised to find that, well over 50% of the reason people churn has nothing to do with wages. It's a lot of it's avoidable. And creating a culture isn't about a one-time kind of thing. It's about this continuous pulse and engagement, and truly caring about, providing a good number of opportunities, benefits, learning, growth, et cetera, you name it. And we've been fortunate to sort of stumble upon this. I mean, you remember our journey. We have a background in Wi-Fi. So when you talked about servers and talked about speed tests, all that, is our background. And our genesis was really, we were doing things in the hotel space. Someone had said, can you figure out a way to get feedback from guests when they're signing in the Wi-Fi network? Because, we used to show ads for access to increase internet penetration in India. And so we had developed that, and hotels are very transient environments. It's this natural flow. You can kind of intermediate the feedback, and that delighted the hotel customers we were serving, actually Indian American Gujarati hotels, and in the US eventually, but initially in India. And we were trying to think about where could we take this idea of natural feedback collection to a larger market. And so we had showed it to somebody, and he got very excited, and he was at a Fortune 500, and he said, can you figure out a way to do this for my package handlers? I hire 150,000 of them. And that actually led us on this path where we had the kiosk, and we create this continuous engagement every day. And there are a lot of great tailwinds now, this increased focus on employee experience, AI, the focus on the frontline market. So we're very fortunate in all of that. And I, just remember your stories of focusing in that market. And hopefully our timing is actually right, because similarly, we are leading the market today. And, the assumption is as we continue to succeed, there'll probably be others that enter the space. But one thing we want to do is kind of be clearly defined as the category creator. And it's exactly why we're having these podcasts like this, right? Is to kind of make sure we stay on top of the trends and provide thought leadership to the space. So that's all great. So let's transition from BabaJob.
And actually, one point that reminded me on that thing was actually talking about the hotels, right? And talking about deskless workers. I mean, I think there's an interesting parallel there in the sense that if you're a hotel owner and you get ahead of your, now any hotel or any hospitality business is very concerned about their like TripAdvisor rating, right? And you want to know, right? And so being able to capture that feedback early on and know from your customers, okay, something isn't right here, and not waiting to see that thing show up on TripAdvisor derives, and it's a tremendous value, right? And then it's a very similar thing. It's going to reduce the amount of money you're going to have to go out and acquire customers, because if you have a good rating, you have a referral network, you have repeat customers. Same thing for a business, right? If you can get ahead of your problem that you may not even know about and get to know that feedback early on before it shows up on a Glassdoor type of company, which Glassdoor is obviously not targeted towards deskless workers, so it's a little bit, but there are platforms like, I remember there was one, Labor Voices. There are some platforms emerging, and I'm sure there'll be a bigger one out there at some point. But there's a lot of word of mouth there, and so if you stay ahead of it, you can actually do yourself a great service as a business, both for your customers or from your employees, right?
Are there any findings or insights you can share about the deskless or frontline workforce, even in your conversations when you were on the ground, that were great ideas that they even suggested or that companies often dismissed or overlooked, that may come to mind out of curiosity?
I think it's hard to know where to begin. I mean, there's so many things that you can pick up, and it's so different, I think, by region, right? And what kind of drives someone, But I think we've covered a lot of the points there that, in the sense that, hey, if you can nip these problems in the bud, people want to, but I think that's the main thing. I think in any employee, no matter what level you are, it's like you want to be heard. I think you touched on that point, right? I think that's one of the most important things to keeping someone engaged and say, hey, I can actually, I feel like I have a platform to express myself. And sometimes that's not always, in person, in like a one-on-one, or you need kind of everyone is different, right? Everyone needs a different way to express themselves, right? And so it's like some people will be able to communicate one-on-one. Some people would like a town hall where they can have a Q&A. Some people want to have an anonymous platform where they can give feedback without being identified, right? And so I think you need to, as a business, you need to switch on multiple channels if you really want to hear what people are saying, right? There's so many factors in play here that you have to kind of think through, that you don't have to think through as much, perhaps in a desk worker scenario, and especially. But I think that's what's interesting about our current time. It's made you think through it a little bit more, because now have remote folks are remote. They're not in the back in the day, as you're working, let's say, with all white collars, instead of just going to tech office, you could just call everyone around a table, say, hey, listen, this is what's happening, and you could but now people are all over the place, right? So I think it's the general environment is also making people think about all their types of different categories of workers differently.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the questions we've seen asked on the kiosks is, what's the first language you've learned to speak? And there was Spanish, there was English, there was Mandarin, there was Korean, a couple others. And it's so fascinating and interesting to see that. Now, I'm not an HR expert, so I'm not sure exactly what you're allowed to ask and not ask from an HR perspective, but this is merely relaying what we see through a large data set of different kinds of content. And what's fascinating is you see those responses, you see those engagements, and we've actually seen moments where that has informed decision-making. So you talked about a town hall. We've seen people write things around wishing a town hall was conducted in Spanish or having a translator, because if a high percentage of the workforce doesn't even understand what's being said in a town hall, how can you expect them to execute on what you want them to do? And again, it sounds so obvious, but so much of what often happens is this assumption, like, I'm an executive and those are my frontline workers and they do as I say. And that mindset is obviously shifting with progressive-minded, forward-thinking companies and younger leaders and generation that sees the world differently. And that's a good thing. the thing that excites me too about what we do is that so much of how we make these assumptions is based on like, I think, or, I believe, when really we should be saying the data suggests this is what people want. And rather than guessing, let's put a couple of things in there that we're willing to do within our budget and let them decide. Give them that voice. What's the detriment to us as a company to allow people to have some level of autonomy in what they want to see? Whether it's, what restaurant we should order food from, how we should help alleviate people who have to stand all day, and there's numerous examples. So if anything, I think the path you laid forward with Babajob and being an early trendsetter, and for us, initially stumbling upon this in 2018, in 2019, is Click It growing very quickly, and then COVID being a major inhibitor. Even COVID as an example, we developed a QR code during that time. And so many people thought, who are especially in knowledge workforces or behind desks, hey, everyone's going to use a QR code. No one's going to touch the screen during COVID. Even during the depths of COVID, it's like 80, 90% of the workforce still touch the screen. There'd be a hand sanitizer next to it. Nobody contracted COVID from our kiosks, at least to our knowledge. And when we asked the workforce, why did you still touch the screen rather than using the QR code? They would tell us things like, I don't believe it's truly anonymous on my phone if I use a QR code, which is true, by the way, because you can plant a cookie, you can know an IP address, or, their sanitizer, I don't believe I'm going to contract COVID from touching the screen. So it's interesting. People have these hypotheses, but the best thing is just ask, listen, learn, follow through. And I think that's one thing we're able to do really, really well at scale. And so your story from Babajob and your time today, I appreciate your sharing some of that journey with us. Is there anything else you want to share or say before we wrap up?
Actually, one other point, as you were talking, I was remembering visiting, I think at this age, we're just all so like, I think detached from like what actually happens behind, like when you go, when you think about it, most people don't realize what happens behind the screen. Once you go and click and buy something online. I wish there were more ways for folks to see what happens behind the scene when you actually go and kind of order something, right? And I think there would be a lot more empathy and a lot more kind of listening if we were able to unlock that. So there's something to think about.
Fantastic. Well, this was a lot of fun. Thank you so much.